Hi, this is Jørgen Rasmussen. Welcome to the Provocative Hypnosis blog. This particular episode is about how to detect lies and how to detect deception. Or, more realistically, how to become better at detecting lies and detecting deception. This particular vlog does not focus on what most other folks focus on when it comes to detecting deception. You know, most resources, books of various quality, it tends to emphasize, either body language or the combination of verbal utterances and nonverbal behavior to attempt to detect deception. And there's a lot of good resources and sources for that, so I'm not going to go into that at all. This is more about you becoming more honest, and as a result of that, being able to detect lies and deception better in other people, because you're no longer using them so much to maintain your own self-deception. So let's get to this. Now, let me ask you a question. What does it feel like to be lied to? And what does it feel like to be wrong? Now, if you're like most people, you're going to answer, well, it feels bad, or it sucks, or I get angry, or so on and so forth. But if you answered that, you didn't actually answer my question. You answered a different question. What you answered was, what does it feel like to discover that you've been lied to or deceived? Those are two very different questions. So discovering that you have been lied to or deceived is one thing, but being lied to doesn't feel a particular way. Being wrong on a particular topic doesn't feel a particular way. So if I were to ask you, what does it feel like to be wrong on a topic? You may answer, well, I'd be embarrassed, or I'd be shameful, or I'd be scared, or I'd be curious, or I'd be optimistic to learn, so on and so forth. But again, that's answering a different question. That's answering, what does it feel like to discover that you're wrong on a topic? Being wrong on a topic doesn't have a particular feeling. It doesn't feel any different than thinking that you're right on a particular topic. So the first hint here is to realize that your feelings don't tell you about deception or lies. The feeling of certainty is just that. It's a feeling. It's the end result of a neurological process. In and of itself, it tells you nothing about whether you are correct or incorrect about a topic, or incorrect or correct about whether someone else is lying or not. So my first tip to you would be, don't trust your own feelings. Don't use your feelings as a guide to other people. And this is, of course, the scientific way to look at it, because if you ask people, and there's a lot of research having been done on this, if you ask people, are you good at detecting lies? Most people will say yes. People often say, I read other people like an open book. But when people get tested, in the lab, very few of us really score much better than 50%. If you look at professions like law enforcement, judges, lawyers, psychologists, forensic psychiatrists, stuff like that, who may testify in court, as a group, they don't score any higher than 54%. So let's say that someone's been charged with child molestation, for example. And in this particular case, the person is either guilty or innocent. Now, you can be sure that there are people in that jury or people in that room who feel that the person is guilty, or feel that the person is innocent. But again, these feelings don't really tell you about whether the person is innocent or guilty. The actual evidence does. So the feelings tell you about your perceptions, the story, the theory that you have about what has happened, the theory you have about who that person is and what motives that person has. So the feelings will be a barometer that tell you to what extent you've bought into that and to what extent that looks real to you. Feelings tell you nothing about truth. But to what extent that story matches up with actual evidence is not to be found in your feelings. It's to be found in an investigation, where you look at whether the behaviors and the available evidence, how that matches up. So in the case of this particular court case, whether the person is innocent or guilty, the people who are wrong in that particular instance, they don't have a different feeling quality. Like there's nothing in their feeling quality that tells them that they're wrong compared to the other folks who, in this case, whose perceptions better match the evidence. There's nothing in the feeling qualities in and of themselves that tells them anything about that. So be skeptical of your own feelings of certainty. Be skeptical of your own feelings of certainty. There's a very nice way you can help yourself to be less prone to automatically buying into your own feelings of certainty, and that is a little habit. If you can stop and ask yourself, and I'll give credit to Jennifer Garvey Berger for just these two questions. If you can stop yourself and ask yourself, what do I believe, and how could I be wrong? That tendency has a tendency to open up your mind a little bit more. So what do I believe is a nice question, because for many of us, a lot of the time, it doesn't look as if we believe stuff. It looks as if we're just perceiving reality or feeling reality as it is. So that little question, what do I believe, kind of nudges your brain to realize that, okay, this is a belief. And how could I be wrong? That tendency, that habit of just looking for how you could be wrong, even when you have feelings of certainty, is a nice way to nudge you to not so easily buy into your own bullshit. So that's the first hint. Second hint is, don't be a cynic. Don't be gullible, but don't be a cynic either. A lot of people think that it's the most kind of hardcore, jaded, cynical people who are the best at detecting deception. This turns out to not be the case. And there's a very good reason for this, and that is, if you're going to become good at, for example, let's say back in the courts, let's say that someone is charged with a rape. Now, is this person actually a rapist, or does he just appear to be, an offender? Well, if you're going to get good at making those types of distinctions, you need to be exposed to those types of situations, and you need a feedback system. You need some feedback system that alerts you to what patterns you saw and projected were accurate and which patterns you saw and projected were not accurate. If you don't have that feedback system, then having a lot of experience is not going to help you. It's not going to make you any better. You're just going to think that you're getting better. So this is one reason why, if you look at, for example, high court judges, people who have decades of experience on the bench, they're not better at detecting deception. If you look at experienced police officers, they're not better at detecting deception. If you look at experienced psychologists, they're not better at detecting deception. A lot of people think that experience in of itself, being in the situation and dealing with criminals or offenders or whatever, will automatically make you better at detecting deception. No, it won't. It won't. Unless you have a feedback system that alerts you to pretty immediately which of the patterns you saw or projected were accurate and which weren't. So in this case, if the judge convicts the wrong person, or a guilty person goes free, the chances that the actors in that particular system will get that feedback and discover where they went wrong is really, really slim. So this is another tip. Be very skeptical of experience. Experience in and of itself. Meaning, there's actually some studies showing that very experienced judges tend to be slightly worse at new judges in detecting deception and deceit. And this sounds kind of counterintuitive, but if you have a lot of power and you have no personal risk for the decisions that you make, which they don't, they're protected by the system, and if you don't have that feedback mechanism, what's happening to a lot of these judges is that they get more confident over time, and they trust in their experience, they trust in the system, that self-image gets reinforced by their environment. Fewer people challenge them. So as a result, it's very easy to think that these feelings of certainty tell them anything. So they may stop listening, or they listen along well-heard tracks, because they've heard everything, they've seen everything. So there's some automatic heuristics and biases. This is case number 4000. They just listen along well-heard tracks, so to speak. And that's not a good strategy for seeing something new or hearing something new, or seeing or hearing something that's outside of your own current beliefs. So a jury member or a new judge may be less prone to making exactly that mistake, which then sometimes can make it more likely that they may, emphasize that word, may sometimes be able to detect that maybe something a little bit off, where the judge is just completely confident. So distrust your own experience and distrust the authority and the experience of other people. The fact that someone is very self-assured and that they have a lot of confidence, or even, it's not quite the same thing, but arrogance, a lot of power, a lot of status. Be skeptical of that. Have a little warning system in your head that says that, look, people who have a lot of power usually get worse at perspective taking over time because they don't have to, and they're often well protected, and they very often are surrounded by yes men who speculate and who tell them what they want to hear. You can see this very often with politicians, certain academics, certain leaders of big organizations, where it's like they live in a bubble. Like they're not reality testing well. They're not really in touch with what's going on, often in a way that's kind of astounding. And here you have some of the psychological mechanisms at play. So here's a larger point. Getting back to the don't be a cynic thing, well, don't be gullible either, but you need to give yourself the chance to experience deception and to experience being lied to, so that you actually have a chance to discover these things. This is why the cynics aren't the best, because since they're so cynical and so jaded and often so conservative in their thinking, they very often rob themselves of the opportunities to actually discover to what extent their particular biases may be on point or not. And as a result, their faith in their own abilities to detect deception is very often quite overrated. Now, here's something else that you want to do and want to be very aware of, and that is that if you ask those people, why do you vote the way you vote? Or why do you have the beliefs that you have? People will usually say, well, I've had life experience, I've done stuff, I've learned stuff, and then I've used reason and logic to kind of arrive at my current position. You know, this is a form of self-deception. It really appears that way. But if you look at the more modern scientific psychological research, it largely points to us doing the opposite, meaning the brain as a belief engine. We have a tendency to believe first, to very quickly generate a narrative, generate a story, a theory of what may have happened. This often happens extremely, extremely fast. And then we have a tendency to use our logic and our reasoning capacities to, like a good lawyer, to create a narrative, to kind of create a case that reinforces what we already believe. Now, this is especially problematic, especially given that it looks to us as if we're doing the opposite. And one way we become less wise often with time is that we unconsciously build a life for ourselves that has a tendency to bolster and reinforce the beliefs that we have. So we may watch the same news channels, we may read the same papers, we may hang out with people who more or less share our biases. And this all reinforces the idea that, I essentially see things as they are. So here's an interesting thing to do. Try to read books by people you dramatically disagree with, whether it's around politics or religion or whatever. Seek out the people who seem to provoke you. Read the people who you disagree with the most. Take a look at the worldviews that just don't make sense to you, and see if you can understand them well enough that you could argue for them. So one task I've often given clients who seem very certain and very righteous and very convinced of their own beliefs is that I've often given them the task of going out into the world and arguing convincingly for the opposite position. So if they're for capital punishment, for example, have them argue against it, or vice versa. Or if they are, on the left politically, have them argue as if they're on the right, or have them argue as if they're a libertarian or an anarchist or something like that. Now, there are two reasons for doing it. You'll get much better at arguing for your own position if you actually understand the opponent's position, but it also listen to the ways in which you could be wrong. Listen for what you haven't seen or for what you haven't heard. Remember that everyone else is the hero of their own stories. So look for how this other person is a hero in their own story. Look at how would you have to make sense of the world to act and think in that particular way. Don't just stop at he's a psychopath or he's an idiot or he's just completely dishonest. Really look into the idea that this person is actually the hero in their own story, and given how they think, how they vote, how they believe, how they do what they do actually makes sense to them, and see if you can open up for that. This will, in a sense, make you more honest, because a big problem with a lot of us when we discuss and debate people is that, let's say someone has opinions or a worldview or a way of thinking that is alien to ourselves. We use ourselves as a reference. So we then go, oh my God, if I were to write that, if I were to say that, if I were to vote that, I would have to be an idiot, or I would have to be evil, or I would have to be psychopathic, or I would have to have no scruples or conscience or morals or ethics whatsoever. And then we project that onto the other person. And then we treat the other person as if he or she is that character and think we're being critical. But we're not. We're just projecting our own stuff. We're essentially saying, for me to vote that way or argue that way, I would have to be a complete idiot. Yeah, given your way of thinking, yes. But open up for the idea that for that person, he or she is the hero in the story. And that way of behaving or being in the world actually makes complete sense to them. So given that, it's very likely that their motives, their characteristics are quite different than the somewhat stereotypical qualities and motives and attributes that you may be attributing to them. So be aware of that as well. Check your own cognitive dissonance, meaning, given that all of us are the hero in our own story, let's say I do something bad. So for example, this morning I was in a slight car accident. I actually bumped into another car, and it was my mistake. The whole thing was my mistake, right? But I noticed, and I took responsibility for it. But I noticed how quickly my mind was kind of looking for excuses and looking to make the other person the bad guy in that particular encounter, because that would reinforce the notion of me as the kind of hero in the story. Now, I checked that. I was aware of it. But let's say I bully someone or do something bad to someone. This puts me in kind of a bind, because on the one hand, I'm the hero in the story. This is a natural bias. But then I've done these things. How will my brain naturally have a tendency to want to resolve this conflict? Well, projecting motives and characteristics onto the other person, as in the other person deserved it, or was a jerk, or was an idiot, or whatever. Because if I can project onto the other person that the other person is like that, then I get to remain the hero in the story. This is also how, if you look at stuff like domestic violence, partner violence, when this sort of stuff escalates over time, it often starts with less severe stuff. And the person who's doing the offending, the cognitive dissonance gets resolved by projecting onto the other person qualities and motives that reinforces, this person being the hero in the story. And this is how, the worse someone often treats someone else, the more they end up disliking the other person, because they kind of have to remain the hero in the story. And once they dislike and hate the other person enough, then that may really justify some horrible behaviors. And the person who's doing the hitting or the abusing or whatever is still the hero in the story. So you want to know that your brain's tendency is to do these things. And you want to create rituals for yourself where you look for the ways in which you're wrong, or where you don't engage in that type of stuff. That's going to make you more honest. And it's not going to make you see people as they are, but you're going to be less likely to use them, meaning you're going to be less likely to project onto other people motives and characteristics to maintain a particular self-concept about yourself. This is an extremely, extremely important point. Now, here's a final tip. Beware of your own projections. What we humans have a tendency to do is that we have a tendency to project onto other people motives, characteristics, traits, beliefs, values, behaviors that reinforce how we want to see ourselves. This can very often turn into a way of self-deception. So, for example, if I'll give you an example from my practice, because I see clients all day. And one thing I've seen a lot, and this is common with both men and women, but sometimes more common with women, is that you have the very nice woman who puts up with the either abusive, cheating, swindling husband that, just lies and lies and lies and lies and lies and lies and lies over time. And then the woman, gets devastated, and she's been duped and she's been tricked, and and the other person's a psychopath and he's horrible, and so on and so forth. Now, if you are that person who's being deceived and tricked, realize this: there are no victims. There's only volunteers. Meaning, if it happens once, fine. But if it happens again, you're actually a volunteer. You're not a victim. You're a volunteer. The victim role will make you more dishonest. It will make you engage in more self-deception, and it will make you see people in less realistic ways. So, yes, the partner may have been cheating and lying, and the partner may indeed have a very bad set of ethics. This may all have been true. But the person who stays in that type of relationship over time is not helped by exclusively pointing the finger outwards to the partner's dishonesty. Yes, deal with that, acknowledge that, but it would be way more useful if the person could look at their own lack of honesty. Because if you're in a relationship for many years with a very dishonest person, you're not being honest. You're not being honest. It doesn't match. Because what's going to happen is that you're going to begin to justify and rationalize and be dishonest yourself to somehow rationalize the dishonest behavior of the other person. So here's the trick. Don't use yourself as a reference. Because very often we want other people to be loving. We want other people to be kind. We want other people to be honest, which is fair enough. But then we demand that they be that way, right? And as soon as you start evaluating and judging other people based upon how you insist they should be, you're setting yourself up for a lot of self-deception. What you want to do is that you want to base your expectations on your partner or your child or your coworker on their behavior, not your values, not your beliefs, not how you would like the world to be. You want to base it on their consistent behaviors over time. Meaning, if your brother has a tendency of asking to borrow money, and it's a pain and a hassle to get the money back, and often he doesn't pay, if that's his pattern, don't expect him to be honest. That's dishonest on your part. Because then you're basing the expectation on an idealized idea that people should be honest. Based it upon his consistent behavior over time. Meaning, if he has a tendency to want to borrow money and not pay it back, expect that he'll likely want to borrow money and not pay it back. Then you're using his behavior over time as the criteria for your expectations. Thereby, you end up with more realistic expectations. It's not perfect. You can't always get people's intent and motives by their behavior, but it's still the best metric. Look at how someone has consistently behaved in a context over time and expect them to more or less behave that way. Now, if they change their behavior for the better or the worse, you adjust your expectations based upon their actual behavior, not upon how you would like them to be or how you would like to see them. Now, there's a trick here as well. Base your expectations upon their consistent behavior over time, but open up for the possibility that they may change. Because if we project onto people that they are that person, and we kind of insist that they are that way, that can very often reinforce the behavior as well. I see this quite a bit with clients who may have been duped in relationships, and they come in and they say, yeah, my ex-husband was a psychopath and he's completely this and he's completely that. This is often a trap. Now, you can rate the person's behavior and said, look, when it came to fidelity or when it came to finances or my husband did a lot of lying or this person has some very narcissistic traits, or his ethics is not good, that's fine. But the problem with labels like psychopath is that the more you can attribute onto the other person the qualities of the psychopath, the more that reinforces the qualities in you as a victim who was just duped and couldn't help it and is kind of powerless. And that's a form of self-deception. That's a form of dishonesty. Because I heard that just the other day, she was with a psychopath, and when you're with a psychopath, you have no chance. You just get pulled down, you just get manipulated. Well, so if you get to attribute the qualities of the psychopath onto the other person, well, again, if that reinforces a victim mindset in you where you can't help it, and where there's no learning in that, there's no growth in that, there's no chance for you to get more accurate perceptions. So be aware of how you use other people to maintain your own identity and your own self-concept. And we all do this. We all do this. So become aware of it. Become aware of it. Try to, and again, this isn't perfect. A lot of our mental life we have no access to, so a lot of this is guesswork. But take a person, for example, who claims to be extremely tolerant and who never judges anyone. Well, it's impossible. It's probably a lack of self-insight if someone makes that claim. But let's say you have a person who's really dedicated to never judging anyone. Well, it could be a person who really lives those values and who is quite non-judgmental. May be the case. But way more often, these behaviors are not necessarily driven so much by compassion and tolerance. Very often you have a person who's very scared of criticism and social rejection, right? It's fear-driven. So they never judge anyone else. And it's kind of like a tacit agreement that if I never judge you, then you'll never criticize me. This isn't really that much driven by tolerance. It's more fear-driven. So there's a sense of dishonesty in it, Or if you have a person who talks a lot about tolerance and diversity, and then they rush to vote on the next totalitarian person who's going to help them, force their visions of the good life and tolerance onto everyone else, whether they want to or not. Well, it really isn't that tolerant. You can look at the people who are very nice, people who are very nice. Well, kindness is a great quality. But if a person is always nice, that's probably not primarily driven by kindness. It's very often driven by fear, by, again, wanting social approval. So if I can only avoid conflict all the time, and if I can be really, really nice and never say anything that offends anyone, then people will have to like me, and I'll avoid conflict. And if I then begin to speculate and tell people what I think they want to hear, this isn't really kindness. This isn't really compassion for other people. It's self-deception. I'm being deceptive towards myself, and I'm being deceptive towards other people because I'm not really sharing what I think and feel. I'm speculating what people want to hear in that case and telling them that under the guise of kindness or niceness, and this is how attempting to avoid conflict all the time can very often lead to more conflict, because the other person is going to pick up on it and call you out on your BS, and then you're not going to be trusted, and then you're going to end up bitter. So I hope these tips were useful. If they evoke anything in you, or if you have any any responses or ideas based upon them, feel free to let me know in the comment section wherever you find the video. Till next time.